Welcome. I'm Carl Frederick, and I will be interviewing individuals for Kenosha Voices, an oral history project of the Kenosha County Historical Society in conjunction with Kenosha Community Media. I have worked in newspapers for more than 40 years as an editor and a reporter. 38 and a half of those years were at the Kenosha News. I am also a member of the Kenosha County Historical Society Board. We hope you enjoy these programs. I'm talking with John Frost, former owner of the Frost Company.
Part of the ownership crew, at least.
Part of the ownership crew,
Yeah.
All right, sorry. When did you start working at the company?
I started working there, Carl, officially in 1972 when I graduated from high school and worked there summer employment in the foundry. And
What did you get paid per hour?
I don't remember exactly what the wages were, but they were really decent, and we were working piecework and a lot of overtime. And let's put it this way, I was able to earn enough money to pay for my tuition and room and board and books and spending money for a year at Madison by working virtually 10 weeks in the summer in the foundry at Frost Company.
How many jobs in the company did you hold?
Well, I held a lot of different positions at different times. I did production work in many areas, the plating area, the foundry I mentioned, and some of the other areas of the plant, and did a lot of the work as I worked my way back into the company when I came full-time in 1976 when I came back, and my dad said, "You got to come back, it's time." And I was just about done with my engineering degree. I needed a few more credits, which I finished at Parkside when I came back.
Okay.
But when I first came back, I came back as in a role in the engineering department and also was training for the factory and factory management and spent time supervising in every area of the company. And that helped expose me, number one, to what we were doing in the areas I hadn't been exposed to in the past, but also to tie in closely with the people, both the supervisors and the production staff that we had in the company, and it was just a fun time and a good learning experience, and I enjoyed it immensely.
And you worked in the company as partial owner with your brothers until it closed in when? We
closed in, officially the last days were in February 1996. And there were multiple stockholders. It was a closely held company, but the vast majority was family ownership, and my three brothers that I worked directly with, and my dad, my grandpa, and my great uncle. My great uncle Jerry was there during the time I was there, one of my grandpa's youngest brother, and we had a few other non-family members who were also part of the ownership who had received stock as part of their employment at different times. And so we had, I think, about 19 different stockholders in the end, something like that.
And how did the company come to be formed?
Well, it started in 1902, and it was originally formed by my great-grandfather and great-great-grandfather together. The earlier one, my great-great-grandfather, Charles Frost, came to Kenosha in the mid-1980s, or 1880s. He was recruited actually to help start up the Chicago brass plant, which became American Brass, or Anaconda American Brass, and was started in the 1880s from a cornfield on up, and was a large producer of copper and brass and non-ferrous materials. He was recruited out of Waterbury, Connecticut, where he had trained from a very young age in the brass business with B&B Brass and some of the other brass companies, and he was actually working brass from age 13 on, and was a noted expert in the field. My great-grandfather similarly had come up through the industries in Waterbury, Connecticut, and came and worked for a short time in Chicago, and then came and joined my great-great-grandfather here. In the late 1890s, they had formed a company called Badger Brass that was associated with the Chicago Brass Company for materials and things, but made carbide bicycle lights and other items that were kind of seasonal in nature. And the idea happened at that point in time with my great-great-grandfather that they needed a product that was more year-round production and more year-round demand. And in those days, the plumbing was moving out of the backyard into the homes, and brass plumbing goods was one of the things that they looked at to match up with the capabilities of Badger Brass as well as the location and everything. And they spun that off with my grandpa, my great-great-grandpa is the president, and my great-grandpa is the secretary-treasurer, his assistant basically, and started up the Frost Company and operated in the same facilities as Badger Brass on 18th Avenue and 63rd Street, which became and was a kind of a building inside of the brass complex, and was originally taken over by the Brass Company, but then moved to 63rd Street or 65th Street and 14th Avenue, excuse me, and built the first of our plant right on that location with railroad access and all kinds of other things. And it was a plant that was added on to many times after that, but it started in 1902 and continued on through 5 generations and had a lot of success and a lot of fun.
Okay, well, your first job in the foundry, can you tell us what a day in the foundry was like?
Sure. Back in those days, we were starting early. We typically started at 6 a.m. or even, depending on the day, sometimes 5 o'clock in the morning, because we were working massive amounts of overtime because of the demand was there. And we also did a lot of our melting of the brass on off hours to get better rates for electricity and things like that. So we started melting brass at night and then poured out throughout the day. It was typically a pretty hot operation. As you can imagine, molten brass and pouring at about 2,200 degrees. There's a lot of heat generated when you're doing that. And the foundry building had overhead doors that were open as much as we could have them open for cooling and airflow and all the rest of it, but the humidity level and the heat level were still pretty extreme. It was a dirty environment too, because we used sand molding, which compressed sand into cubic molds ready to be poured into, and then those molds would go through and get poured and the metal poured into them, and they'd come around and do an operation that was called shakeout, where you would break up the sand mold and the castings would still be glowing red, solidified, but glowing red, and you'd take those out and separate them out to go and be worked on further. My first job was working this shakeout, and that included pushing molds onto the pouring lines and working with the molds once they were poured and breaking them up as I described. And it was an interesting area to work in because it was a very team environment. Everybody from the molders, the operators actually making the molds, all the way down through the pouring and the shakeout, were all tied together. If one part of that failed, the whole system had shut down, and our goal was to pour the maximum amount of molds we could pour in a shift or per hour, or however we were measuring on that day. And we did great work. We had a pour-off man who was incredible. Johnny Steele was his name, and he had a handicapped leg, so he walked with a limp. But he was one of those guys who was completely V-shaped. His upper body and the strength of his upper body from all the work was just incredible, and one of the nicest gentlemen I ever worked with in my life. And we had many of those people in our operation that just came to be friends, and not just people that you'd walk by, but people you knew about the families, you knew about what was going on. Some of them had kids that were working in the plant and all the rest of it, because we weren't just multi-generation of Frost, we were multi-generation of the many other families that had been involved in the company.
How did you move these glowing pieces of castings out? I mean, how did you carry them out with iron tongs, or what did you do?
Well, in the beginning, the molds were 20 by 24 inch by about 12 inches tall, and they were on a piece of heat-resistant material and went down conveyors. And then through the pouring stage, they were all on conveyor, on roller conveyors. Some powered, some not, and when they came into the shakeout area, the remaining castings that were shaking out in this literally shaking bin with a grate on the bottom of it would be in there, and we would shovel them into large carts that we would transport them to the finishing area of the foundry. And it was pretty good work, but it was tough work, and I was a lot stronger and a lot lighter back then, and it was good work to keep you in shape for sure.
What kind of safety equipment was required in the foundry?
In the foundry, we had all kinds of things from suits that were made out of like Kevlar material with reflective for the heat. We had face shields and safety glasses and hearing protection, and even masks similar to the N95 mask used today for COVID, very similar to that. And back in those days, we had to be fit tested for the masks actually because of the lead component of brass. Brass is made up of copper as the base material, but then tin, lead, and zinc, and so all the brass had lead as a component. So we had to be fitted for these masks, and you couldn't have any facial hair. That was one of the things. And today with COVID, you see everybody, including myself, with our COVID beards and what have you. And but back in those days, we were actually fit tested by 3M, where the mask came from, and we were very diligent about watching for exposure to lead and washing up and all the cleaning operations that went on. Beyond that, we had safety shoes that had steel toe or steel arches to prevent things from coming through the bottom of the shoe or dropping on the toes, and a lot of leg guards for the people working on the pouring line. So any splash over material would go on the leg guards, and the whole factory was safety glass required in all production areas. So that was a requirement, and almost everybody wore hearing protection of one kind or another, either muffs or earplugs. And it could be a noisy environment in different spots for sure.
What kind of training did you get before you started at the foundry or in the plating area?
Well, I had a lot of firsthand exposure because even as a little kid, we'd go in there on Saturday mornings with my dad and probably create havoc more than anything else, but we were exposed to the environment. And I had just a good mechanical sense myself, so I was involved in a lot of the things and understood. I did my drafting work for my 8th or 9th grade drafting class in Lincoln Junior High School. I did a lot of work at Frost Company on the drafting tables at Frost Company. I ended up doing that for part of my work when I was back at the company, but it was, the exposure over time to what was going on there was there both in our family life and just going over there. And I was hands-on trained by people who were experienced in running the operations when I got there as well. In Madison, I studied industrial engineering, which included a lot of the components of what we were doing at Frost Company, everything from time study work and motion study and things like that through the mechanical design and concepts. And so I guess I received training in a lot of different ways, but I was a sponge and I absorbed a lot of it, and just it's stuff that sticks with me today. I can still picture how we ran a lot of the operations and what we did and the mechanical components. And some of the things that people don't know that we made at Frost Company were we made steel fire extinguisher shells. The actual round part of a fire extinguisher is a drawn component that's made out of flat steel and then drawn down through multiple die operations. And it's a complex operation because the dies and the tooling have to fit, and whether you run something through 2 or 3 draws, everything gets smaller and longer, and it's a lot of engineering that goes into it. In fact, engineering was at the core of our company for almost the entire time. My predecessors were all engineers. My dad and grandfather were mechanical engineers out of UW-Madison, both of them. And my great-grandfather and great-great-grandfather were mechanically trained. My great-grandfather was a tool and die maker training, as well as all the engineering that went with it. And they were smart guys. And in a time when there wasn't a lot of training except the apprenticeship type training that went on in those days that they went through. So we sponsored apprenticeship programs at Frost Company for many of our skilled trades, electricians, tool and die makers, just to name two, and did a lot of work with what was Kenosha Technical Institute and then became Gateway Technical, where I actually work today. But apprenticeship training was big for our employees, and it was big for us as a company.
What other products did Frost Company make?
Well, we made, our initial product was brass plumbing that I mentioned, under the sink, under the tub, brass plumbing goods. Some of it exposed and easily seen, and some of it buried in the walls. But we expanded on from that to do a lot of production work for other companies that utilized the equipment that we had in the factory. Contract work, we made radiator fittings for Modine and Racine, and Syncrator, you know, the garbage disposal components. We made some of the parts that fit into the sinks and different parts of that. So those were kind of extensions of the plumbing line. Beyond that, we made the fire extinguisher shelves that I mentioned before. We bought a line of production from Bridgeport Brass in the early 1950s that brought in the brass 5-gallon fire extinguishers were one of the first components in there, and went into steel fire extinguishers, and there's lots of different versions of that you can see in my house for one place. But we did a lot of drawing work, which also fit in then to other product lines that we got into the mid-70s. We got into what's called swimming pool deck trim equipment when we bought a production company from Abingdon, Illinois. American Standard was American Sanitary was the company, and they were part of the Stay-Right Industries. They made the pumps, and then they made the deck trim equipment in Abingdon. And it was everything from ladders and handrails and diving towers, through gutter drains and swimming pool lights and fittings and everything you can possibly imagine that would go into basically the in-ground pools of all sizes, from backyards up through municipal pools and high school pools. So we had products literally all over the world that were part of that line. Brass castings that tied into our foundry, and brass fittings that tied similarly back into the original plumbing line type capabilities, but beyond that into a tremendous amount of stainless steel, tubular stainless steel. We used millions of pounds every year and feet of tubular stainless steel that came from Beloit, Wisconsin, from a company called United Industries that made all of our stainless. And so we had a truck running 3 to 4 days a week between Kenosha and Beloit, bringing production material in, and a lot of just-in-time delivery and just-in-time inventory to put it right into the machines and then out the back door to ship it. And it was an interesting business that we got into and then expanded in the 80s when we bought another line called SwimQuip, which was even better diving towers and stands, and in that end that we expanded our line with. And that was actually the final production line that was running when we sold the company in the very end to our #1 competitor. And it was an exit strategy that at the time we had to really take advantage of, because we were just in a position where it was make that move or really take it down and miniaturize it even further. But it was the survival mode that we went into in the mid-1990s.
Okay, when you came back to the company in '76, what was your job then at the?
I came in to the engineering department. My technical job was an engineer, product engineer. I worked for the two gentlemen that were directly ahead of me, and the next step up where the chief engineer was my direct boss, and then the vice president of manufacturing was his boss, and the next step would have been my dad, the president. So I came in that role, and the chief engineer, Don Kibler, and Harry Kalvanchin was the vice president of manufacturing. Harry actually passed away about a year and a half after I got back to the company. And unfortunately, Don, who was much younger and completely unexpected, passed away just a few months later. And I ended up taking 2 jumps up to run the manufacturing in 1978, and 77 and then 78. And so I became the plant manager and then technically the vice president of manufacturing, and went from there to be the executive vice president in 1985. With my dad still as the president, and he passed in 1988, and I became the president of the company in August of 1988.
There was a strike at the plant in 1977. Did you play a role in solving that strike, or?
Yeah, I'm not sure solving it is. we got into a situation. We'd only had one other strike before that, and we had three unions at the shop when I came back there, and for many years before that, we had our main production union, which was the Allied Industrial Workers at the time I came back, the AIW, and then we had our skilled trades were all represented by the machinists, Local 34, which also represented Snap-on Tools and Ocean Spray, and many companies around Kenosha were represented. Bill Holland was a business agent and just a wonderful, honorable guy. And our third union was our buffers and platers, which was Local 45, again, a union that was also represented at Snap-on Tools when they were running production here with their plating operations and buffing. The second 2 unions were the smaller 2 unions. The Allied Industrial Workers were the ones that went on strike. And we bargained 3-year contracts and bargained in the spring with the AIW. And we were bargaining towards an April 1st deadline in 1977. And I was a junior member of the bargaining team with my dad and our CFO at the time. And so I was in negotiations, and we had an agreement and a handshake deal at the table, and they went and voted to not accept the agreement when they got into the group union meeting and voted on the contract. It extremely frustrated my dad at the time, because our labor relations, we believed, were wonderful, and I think most of our employees did too. We had very proactive labor relations with everybody there, and the business agent came from out of town, and 2 of them did. The buffers and platers came from Ohio, and the business agent for the AIW came from Milwaukee, and wasn't somebody who was normally in our plant every day or every month, and I think put a little bit of a wrench in the bargaining. That was kind of the thought we had at the time, and the voting. But we went out on a 4-week strike. And my dad kind of said at that point in time, I'm not going to sit at this table anymore, you are. And here I was at 23 years old, getting ready to take over all the labor relations. I was doing the day-to-day when I was running the plant, and so I had that most of the time with the grievance and the meetings and the things that we discussed with the unions almost daily and different things. But our idea was to stay ahead of things, and you know, if problems cropped up, we took care of them, and very open communications, all directions. In fact, I mentioned when we were talking the other day that one of the proudest things of my working career was I received a grievance from the machinist union, and the grievance was a grievance that stated there was nothing to grieve, and it was tongue in cheek, and we got along really well. But it was a proud thing for me, because when you get to the point where there's absolutely nothing that's stern in the background to come up, and we're talking regularly, I took it as a huge compliment. I know they meant it that way too. And it has stuck with me, obviously, to this day, and will stick with me the rest of my life. But it was how we wanted to run our shop. It was a family operation, and it was family in multi-levels. And the communication that we attempted to achieve what was the same thing I wanted to tell my brothers, for the same thing that I talked to the people on the shop floor about, and that was how we ran the operation. That's how it needed to run.
How many employees worked at Frost Company?
We had good levels throughout the time. When I was there, starting in the mid-70s and on, we were about 200, 225, somewhere in that range, total employment. When we stopped making the plumbing goods in 1989, that number dropped because of that line took a lot of people. But prior to that, we'd had varying numbers, Carl, that went up to war production during World War II. It was somewhere between 650 and 700 employees working 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and massive production numbers when the company actually earned multiple Army Navy E awards for excellence, which was when they came out from the War Department and recognized the production that was going on. You received an Army Navy E. I know that the Brass Works received an E. I know that McWhite received an E. I don't know how many they received, but there were many of them around Kenosha for the production that was going on. I believe Triclover received an Army Navy E for their production when they were on 60th Street. But a lot of the recognition, well, went to everybody. It was definitely celebrations that were held with all employees involved, and everybody was part of that process. It wasn't just, the production wasn't just administration, it was everybody working to make that production. And the things that went on in our plant, just to think about the production numbers that went on during those times and recognize the size of the plant at that time in the early 1940s, and some of the things that had to be done, it was just amazing to look back on it from a manufacturing standpoint and realize the hurdles they went over to get the numbers they got to. I mean, literally millions and millions of parts. One of the parts that I showed you guys before is that 20 millimeter brass cartridge. We made about 50 million of them during the 4 years of war production. And that's a tremendous number, but you start thinking about those things, and that's just one component that we made, and realize what went on with the people and how many operations, and it must have been just flying through the manufacturing and coordinated effort. I know that my grandpa used to talk about the negotiations and arrangements through the War Materials Department and what the U.S. did for production during World War II as a country was unbelievable, and how we came together as a country to support what was going on and literally save the world from the things that the United States did. It's incredible, and it's history that doesn't often get played back because it's got a war component to it. But my component to it from an engineering and a management and a recognition standpoint is what our team did. And our team was just an itty bitty team that was part of the whole production in the U.S., but realized what our people went through and did during those years is just, we had 4x8 plywood sheets demonstrating the operations that were up in our shop till the very end. And that was production that was 50 years prior to that was still recognized as things that went on at the company that were unbelievable. And it's just, it's part of the history that was there that I recognize my forefathers for doing some tremendous work along with all the other people that were involved there.
Okay. How many of your brothers were involved in the company at the time?
I've got 3 brothers. There's 4 of us. We don't have any sisters. Now we have sister-in-laws, but all 4 of us were involved in the company. I am the oldest of the 4 and was there the longest. My next brother, Matt, was part of our sales team and involved in sales the entire time he was there. And David, the 3rd brother down, was our production control manager, and was actually a construction management graduate out of Madison and worked in the construction industry. And worked with power plants like the one in Pleasant Prairie. He actually worked there part-time when he was going through school in the construction, then worked for Sergeant Lundy, the contractors that designed that power plant, and many others, and was in Ohio, and he was looking to get back to this area. His wife is from Kenosha also, and they wanted to get back in town, and thought about it, and I thought, you know what, Dave would make a tremendous production control manager, which he did, and we were fortunate enough to get him wanting to come back and to get him out of the construction and into our business. And our material component of the products we made was somewhere around 50% of the end value. And with that component being that high a percentage, it needed to be very well controlled. So everything from raw material coming into the plant to the control of inventory. We had many different parts in the plant. At our highlight, we probably had close to 10,000 different components and or assemblies in our plant and inventory control. And that's anything from little bitty nuts and washers that were part of some of the bathways assemblies and things like that, up through the completed assemblies that were sold to the wholesalers, whether they be a completed ladder or a completed waist assembly or whatever. But that was a tremendous job of keeping that inventory, number one, under control, and number two, the production supporting that inventory being on time and ready to come in, so we were able to do delivery at a high rate of speed. When we started looking at the company in the 80s and trying to reorganize, we actually went in and fully analyzed and were very critical of ourselves, and if an order didn't ship complete, 100% complete, all line items complete from an order, it was marked as a negative, and only positives were the ones that shipped complete and on time. And we looked at our on-time shipping percentage, and that number was below 60%. Not a very good number. And there were things about our routings that were wrong, and there were errors in many areas. And we went on a big effort to control and correct those errors. And we achieved about a 98% on-time delivery in 1987, and then in 88 and 89, those same numbers. And what that brought to us as a connection with our customers was incredible. What it brought to us as a realized savings in our inventory investment was incredible as well. When we were under control and we knew what we were doing with the inventory, we could actually promise orders on a particular date and have them ship on a particular date. And when you're shipping all across the country and you can tell somebody it's going to ship on the 3rd of July and it actually leaves on the 3rd of July, that next order is a lot easier to get. And we went on this campaign to make these corrections and did it. And my brother Dave was one of the spearheads of that. I stopped short. My fourth brother, Tom, is currently the CFO at Bain Nelson Company. He's a CPA by training, and also handled a lot of our personnel work, and did a lot of that work, and was our assistant controller at Frost Company, and just a brilliant guy, and continues to do great work today. And so that was the four of us, and we had a team of a lot of different people who were part of our core group, and running the company and administrating, and just we had a fantastic team.
Did you have any interesting stories, individual stories that you remember during your time at Frost Company?
Yeah, there's probably a few of them that involve my Irish temper. When I had colored hair, it was fairly red, and then but we had a lot of things that we shared together. We played volleyball together at nights. We went out to lunch together. We really worked arm in arm as a management team, working together. We played baseball in the summers together, and city league, softball, all kinds of things that happened.
So this was both administration and the employees.
Oh yeah, yeah, and multiple levels of that. We We had a 20-year club that was really active and recognized people who had been there 20 years. One of the things that I didn't officially get to my 20-year anniversary. I did if you piled up the times I worked there, but I didn't officially get to my 20-year. I was a couple of months short of that. But that would have been one of the things that I would have relished. But we had picnics in the summer for the company picnics. We had Christmas parties, and we had children's Christmas parties, and different things we'd celebrate. When we hit those milestones of the on-time delivery, we had some fantastic lunches and things in the plant, because it really was, there wasn't one person in our entire employment who didn't have a hand in getting to that number. And you know, some of them deeply, deeply involved in it, but everybody involved in it, from doing the best they could and helping get things corrected, making sure our production bills of materials or routings were 100% correct. And it was getting to the point where formalization and understanding was a given. And it wasn't the old run by the seat of your pants type of thing. We needed to know how many parts we could get through a particular operation in a given period of time, along with the exact amount of material and what went into it. And you had to control every aspect of the operation to have it under full control. And we got to that point. It was really satisfying.
Do you still socialize with anyone from the Frost Company?
Oh yeah, yeah.
I mean, other than your brothers?
Oh yeah, I see people quite regularly, and there's a lot of Facebook connections, and you know, the team has spread after the 90s. We were fortunate enough that with the sale of the business and with the prior wind downs, we were able to get everybody employed. It wasn't it wasn't we were able to facilitate them getting employed and open some doors. A lot of the people from the swimming pool production went on with the next company. And some of those ended up moving down to Tennessee, where the business eventually moved to. But it was fun times that we got into that could be just little fun time. You know, one of the things we like to do is joke around. We like to keep things on a lighter scale. There was enough tension just in trying to do what we were doing, but recognizing and having a chuckle with somebody and recognizing when they're doing a great job was something that was key that I wanted to instill. We recognize birthdays, we recognize production goal numbers, but we recognize family events. Unfortunately, when you get that close, you have people who pass away. You know, you'd go into a funeral for somebody who was attached to Frost Company in one way or another and see a ton of Frost Company people there helping to support the family. And I know when my dad passed away in '88, that I can't think of a person that worked at our company who didn't come to that funeral. And, you know, there's probably some bit of obligatory coming to something like that, but it was also because everybody genuinely liked each other. You know how it gets to a point where if people work together, they not only know somebody, but they respect somebody and respect what they do and respect how they do things and how they treat people. And that's the environment we wanted to foster in our company. And we wanted to foster it all the way to our customers. We wanted to be an employer of choice for our employees. We wanted to be a supplier of choice for our customers, and we wanted to be a customer of choice for our suppliers. And those were the three goals that set out the three legs of our focus when we were really driving things. Because if you're doing the right things, your employees want to work there. It's not just a paycheck. It's whether you socialize, whether you eat lunch together, whether, you know, I mean, it's so much more than just a paycheck. And it was for our employees. And there were social groups that were formed. There were the bowling ladies, they called themselves, who were, for us company bowling team and sponsored bowling team and things like that. We had a trap shooting team that we sponsored. We had all different kinds of things that were in the works, but it was more because we respected the things that everybody did for 40 plus hours every week. And it was times when if somebody wasn't there, they had either prearranged a vacation or they were genuinely sick. And there was never any second questions. If somebody called up and said, my kid's sick and can't go to school, well, get them better and come in tomorrow. There was never the, why are you calling in, or the challenging and things like that, because the honesty level was at such a high performance level that it was never even a second question. And not only was it a second question, but people would never even think of saying something because they didn't have to. They knew that when they called up and said something was going on, that they were going to be respected and honored, and that information was going to be received well. And that really puts things on a level that is beyond that paycheck on every Friday. And we got the paychecks out. Everything worked mechanically well, but it also worked in the mind well too, to keep everybody connected that way as well.
What world events or changes in technology affected the company as it started to wind down?
Well, we were affected because of being tied into the brass market, which tied into the copper market. Anything that happened in the copper industry worldwide affected us, and so we were constantly on watch to the copper market to try and predict what was going on with our raw material pricing. An example would be that one year there was a strike in Chile, in the copper mines down in Chile, and it affected our copper prices here in Kenosha the same way, in our brass prices, which some of our materials were priced at the material cost at the time of shipment. Some of them were not, where we had to forecast the pricing and stay with forecasted pricing. And those kind of changes would have some dramatic effect on us if we didn't try and manage them and negotiate and do all kinds of things like that. There were different physical things that happened. We had an earthquake, and one of our suppliers in the Republic of China, the island, literally in the plant where they made some components for us, the earthquake shifted the plant floor where half of the plant was 4 feet above the other half, and so as weird as that sounds, they couldn't drive fork trucks from one side of the plant to the, so their internal, somehow they worked around that problem and like warp speed, and didn't affect our shipments but about a week delay at one point in time by an earthquake and by their whole factory being shifted around, and things like that were incredibly addressed by some of our partners. We had a lot of effect from the interest rate and inflation and things like that, because the housing market, one of the things we tracked with the plumbing goods was the number of new housing starts in the U.S. and that number was reported monthly by the federal government, the number of new housing starts. And as you can imagine today, with the inflation numbers going like they're going now, they did a wild jump in the late 70s and early 80s. I remember when I bought my first house, the interest rate was 16.5%. And I remember at Kenosha Savings and Loan, where I got my first home loan, that I refinanced 3 times in 1 year. And they said if it drops 1%, you're going to save money by refinancing. And that meant it dropped more than 3% in 1 year. I know it started out at that high level and it ended up somewhere down in the single digits over a fairly short period of time, like 4 or 5 years. But things like that affect the housing market, which affected our business, the number of products going out to go into new houses. Less starts, less new plumbing goods needed, obviously. There were all kinds of social things that happened, whether it be new regulations. We went into the OSHA standard for lead in the mid-1980s, which in the end forced us to close our foundry because the things that we were going to have to do to maintain the standards would have cost more than 5 years' profit from that division of the business, that operation, and we couldn't afford to do it. We couldn't afford to borrow the money to do it, and we just couldn't afford to do it. So we ended up shutting our foundry and doing a cleanup on it and all the rest of that good stuff. But the patterns moved to Central Illinois to a foundry that we knew and respected, and they made our castings that we originally made in Kenosha and affected our production here. We had similar things that happened when we went and assessed other ends of our business where we had to make some decisions to either continue or not continue. The swimming pool line was very successful, and we continued that on to the very end.
Any technological things? Competition, global situations?
One of the global situations and semi-competition was the increase of plastics. Plastic industry really started in the plumbing goods in probably the late 1960s, but really has expanded where today a tremendous amount of the plastic or the materials in the home plumbing and are plastic. Everything from the plastic drain, waste and vent pipe that you see all the way through the components. I'm putting in a sink faucet right now in one of our sinks, and there's a large component. Part of it is plastic. We did not get into the plastic from a manufacturing standpoint, and you know, if we had taken the Wayback Machine and gone back, we probably wouldn't have made a different decision, knowing what we know now. But we worked with a company in Illinois, J&B Plastics, and they manufactured and supplied us, along with other people, with many of the components, so we could still have our full line and have plastics well represented. It was nowhere near as profitable or lucrative for us to run as a business, and it really didn't provide any labor from our end other than packaging and shipping, and it dramatically affected what we were doing with the brass line. Technology also expanded in computer numeric control machinery, and we got into that in the end. And would have liked to have been in it deeper had we survived longer. It was tremendous technology and is tremendous technology today, being utilized for the productivity levels that are unbelievable, along with consistency and operational efficiency levels that we were never able to get to that in regular production methods. In today's world too, we train a lot at Gateway, and I actually worked at a company for 3 years that did robotics implementation, and that was after Frost Company and wasn't really, it was just the tip of the iceberg of that was coming in the 90s. But robotics are all over right now in production, and a lot of the repetitive motion things can be done by a robot, and keep the hands and minds of human beings to do the thinking part and the engineering part and the development part, and then turn a robot loose to make 1,000 of them, you know, and then put the mind back on the human being to doing the other part of it. And those are things that I would have loved to have been a part of longer term at Frost Company. We had a lot of the technology end that we started on, and really helped us get to the point where we were able to sell the company. The fact that we knew what we were doing with production and had the inventory control and the production numbers we did was part of what we sold in the very end, because our numbers were very strong, and that helped make a saleable entity in the end.
Could you describe or define a final straw, or was it just a conglomeration of all the factors?
Well, the final straw for us was literally banking, and we got to the point where we had built back and strengthened our relationships with our end customers, and things were going quite well on that end. And we did what you've seen on TV, where not quite as dramatically, but where the boss comes out and hands out airplane tickets and says, "You're going to LA and you're going to Las Vegas," you know, and sends all the people out to meet with the customers. And we did that starting at about 92, where my brother Matt and I each took a third of the country, and Tom Peck, who was our executive vice president and head of sales, took the other third of the country, and we went out and traveled with our sales representatives and went to all of our customers and met and strengthened the relationship and brought out what we had done and how we had done it, and the story of what made Frost Company stronger and a better, really compatriot for their business, and to be that supplier of choice for their business, and strengthened things really well. And we were into the fall of 1995, and the swimming pool season, being somewhat cyclical, started in the fall of the year with shows and preseason orders and setting things up. We shipped preseason shipments starting in January. For January, February, and March was our preseason time when we shipped, and a lot of it going to the southern part of the U.S. And then swimming pool continued strong on through, usually through August, and then had a 2 or 3 month gap there. But we're just into the fall season and starting to book and get things really set up. In our long-term relationship for banking had been with First National Bank in Kenosha on the corner of 6th Avenue and 56th Street. And unfortunately, First National Bank sold multiple times, and Marine Bank and Bank One and different things that came in and took over First National Bank. And it went away from being a locally owned, locally managed bank to being a corporately owned and numbers run bank. And we had set one of our caveats in our loans with the bank, and our operational loans had been our inventory level. And our inventory level never got officially reset when we got out of the plumbing line of business, which was a large portion of our inventory. And we went up in inventory in the swimming pool, but we didn't quite come to the full number value of what the inventory level was in like 1986 or 87. And they pulled our note one day. And I literally came in to work on a Monday morning, and like my dad before me, I was at 7 o'clock in the morning sitting at my desk, and usually 6:30. And I had one of the employees come up and he said, "My check bounced." And I'm like, "You what?" And we started looking at things, and my brother Tom and I went to the bank and got there as soon as there were people there at 8 o'clock in the morning and said, "What's going on here?" Because we knew that we had our finances lined up and things set up, and they'd called our note and took out of our account and settled all of our debt with the bank, but left us with virtually no operating funds at that time. We weren't able to reestablish a new banking relationship, and that was really the final straw that put us at the end. It was frustrating because we had gotten to the point where we believed we were strong, in particular coming into that 96 season would have had a record year, and it just literally chopped the legs out from underneath us, and we ended up going through the official shutdown and wind down and selling and all the rest of it, and it was not a fun time. I remember going out into the shop and setting up the information boards to let everybody know what was going on, what was going to happen, and sending the note off to the state about a decrease of employment, all the things that were going to go on, and it was not good times. We handled it respectfully, I believe, as best we could, but that was really the end of it. And our number one competitor found out very quickly and gave me a call, and he said, "Are you interested in talking?" And I said, "Yes, I am." And one thing led to another there, and they kept the swimming pool production going. The contract production that we were still running went to a business down in Chicago, along with about 30 of our employees to go and run it. And we ended up shutting the business down eventually.
What was the best part of your connection and work with Frost Company?
The best part for me was the personal relationships. both internally and externally. I was able to get through that across the country trips even closer than I'd ever been with many of our primary customers. We'd see them at the annual shows that had happened and things like that, but this was even getting on a much closer level, personal level with these individuals and understanding their business and understanding our impact and inroad in that business. That was enjoyable, really enjoyable. The other part that was enjoyable was the relationships internally and the teamwork that was there. I was always a team player. I played a lot of team sports and was pretty good at younger ages at football and different things. But it wasn't just the scoreboard, and it wasn't just my role. It was what we did together as a team that really was why I enjoyed sports in the end. It's why I enjoyed Frost Company in the end. We had a crew that I think we'd walk into places around town and people would respect us for what we did, and not just because we had the last name. You were talking to Dave Andrea before I walked in here. Dave and I have literally known each other our whole lives. We're the same age. And the respect that I have for Dave Andrea has been lifetime because he's Dave Andrea. It's not the name, it's because of the person. And it's the same thing that happened in our shop. We were joking the other night about something that went on in manufacturing with two of my brothers, and we were just, this is 20, almost 30 years later, and we were laughing about something that happened on the shop floor. And you can just picture, you say somebody's name, and oh yeah, I could just picture him. And it's amazing. We had a gentleman that worked for us who was about the right age to possibly be parented by Joe Lewis, a fighter. And Joe Lewis fought in Kenosha many years ago, and there's an article, or there's a display at the Pleasant Prairie Museum of the times he was here, and I saw the picture last night when I was out there, and it looks identical to this man that worked for us, just identical. And do we know anything? No, but there was always just a little bit of a suspicion that maybe there was a connection there that never got recognized. But we chuckled about things, and it was never a personal affront. It was always us fighting a battle for Frost Company, or fighting on behalf of one of the people we worked with against whatever, helping people with family emergencies and doing things, and just being, if you had somebody sick in your family, or somebody, deathly sick in your family, there was food arriving, and this simple traditions. And we joke in Kenosha amongst our group that we're not 6 steps removed from everybody, we're 3 steps removed from everybody at Kenosha. That's how tight a community it is. And our family was tight in this community for well over 100 years, and still is in many ways. And it's, between my boss who hired me at Gateway, Bill White, who used to work at Snap-on, and we'd go out for lunch and go into one of the local establishments and know half the people in the establishment when we go have a hamburger somewhere. And the other people we worked with who we were going with, do you know everybody in town? Well, yeah, Bill and I have both been here our whole lives in positions where we've known people. And it's weird because you don't go to a lot of cities and find that relationship with individuals, but it's not strange in Kenosha. And it's also part of the enjoyment here. And whether you're going to what used to be the CYC to play volleyball, and half the people who are in the place, or you go to a volleyball game for my son at high school, and I sit down in the stands with people I've known since we went to school there, with teachers who might still be there, those kind of things. That's where Chris and I met each other originally. And but those friendships and those relationships are not limited, and because many people live here their whole lives, they last an entire lifetime. I think fondly of my Aunt Mary Palmer Frost Ashley in the end, but her dad was one of the founders of Snap-on Tools. And half the people I know called her Aunt Mary. I mean, she was Aunt Mary to me, but half the people in the community referred to her as Aunt Mary. And just she had that personality. And my mom had that same kind of personality coming from Wauwatosa, where she came from. And she and my dad met in Madison, and my grandpa and grandma Frost met at Madison, and my grandpa and grandma Philip met at Madison. You know, connections that start out and kind of continue that way. My wife and I didn't meet at Madison, but Dave and Kim went to Madison together, and Matt and Jane went to Madison together. You know, I mean, we've had connections that have gone on like that. Our connection to the UW is very strong. I had 3 of my sons go through the UW, and it's the connections and the things, and that's what really was the fun part about Frost Company all those years. It would be nowhere near as much fun to be an independent operator. And even our successful sales representative agencies had multiple people. They weren't one-person shows. And we'd go out and watch those guys work in the field and what they do. And they were commissioned sales agents, but they were tied to Frost Company products as we were. And part of the reason was because they'd come up and get caught up in the whirlwind of our internal relationships, and then they'd be part of the internal relationships as well. And it was so much fun from that standpoint. That was one of the things I miss that isn't there every day that it was there. I'd love to go back and have it again, but.
Great, thank you, John.
You're welcome.